let me tell you a tale of two continents. One in the Atlantic called Atlantis. Another in the Pacific called Lemuria, Mu for short. 25,000 years ago, these two continents were battling each other on the ideology of the day. Look at them as the two largest children on the block, and the two highest civilizations. At the time, they both had two different ideas about which direction civilization should go. The Lemurians felt that the other less evolved cultures should be left alone to continue on their own evolution scale. The Atlanteans believed that all the less evolved cultures should be brought under sway by the two evolved ones. This caused a series of wars between Atlantis and Lemuria. In these series of wars, thermonuclear devices were used, and when the wars were over and the dust cleared, in reality there was no winter. The outback in Australia, the Mojave Desert, parts of the Gobi Desert and the Sahara are all remains to remind man of the futility of this type of war. During the wars themselves, people highly civilized stooped to quite low levels, but they too, at the end, they realized the futility of such behavior. Lemuria and Atlantis itself became the victims of their own aggressions. Both the Lemurian homeland and the Atlantean homeland had been weakened by the wars, thus they knew that in about 15,000 years both of their continents were going to sink completely. The Atlanteans had the second set of cataclysms which reduced Atlantis from a large continent to a series of islands. Lemuria in essence did somewhat of the same. However, you might say, well, what did that? Why would the people be upset at the time for something that was going to happen 15,000 years in the future? In those days people lived for 30,000 years commonly. They understood many of those who caused the havoc would see the end of the destruction. When Lemuria, which went down first almost 200 years before Atlantis sunk, they petitioned the Agharta Network. The Agharta Network is a network of subterranean cities that is guided by a city called Shambhala the Lesser. To distinguish it from Shambhala the Greater, which is the etheric Shambhala over the Gobi Desert. Shambhala the Lesser was created when the continent of Hyperborea was vacated after Earth lost her mantle and the planet started receiving radioactive waves that they had not been victim to in the earlier times. So they started building subterranean cities over 100,000 years ago. When Atlantis and Lemuria petitioned to build subterranean cities themselves and to be accepted into the Agharta Network, they had to prove to Shambhala the Lesser that they had learned the lessons of oppression, that they had learned the lessons of war. And they also had to prove it to many other agencies, such as the Confederation, which we will go into a little later. Because Atlantis and Lemuria had both been members of the Confederation, and when they started the warlike efforts against each other, they were expelled temporarily from the Confederation and had to prove that they had also learned the lessons of peace to be allowed to be members of the Confederation again, to be accepted into it. Mount Shasta is where the Lemurians chose to build the city. California was part of the colonies, part of the area of the Lemurian lands, and they understood that Mount Shasta and those areas of California would survive the cataclysms, Mount Shasta already being a place of great sacredness on this planet. They chose to reroute the lava tunnels from Shasta itself so that the volcano would not erupt again. And there was already a very large domed cavern within it, and they decided to build upon that, and they constructed the city that we now call Telos. Telos was the name of the whole area of much of what is now the Southwest. And much of what is now California was originally called Telos, which meant communication with spirit, oneness with spirit, understanding with spirit. It was constructed to hold a maximum of 2 miles. Lean people. When the cataclysms started, only 25,000 people were saved. Many had been brought to Telos before the cataclysms started. But when the second set started in Lemuria, the volcanoes started erupting so fast and sent so much debris into the air that while they had intended to save at least 1 million people from the Lemurian mainlands, they were only able to save 25,000. Thus, that was what was left of the Lemurian culture of the Lemurian mainland. Already the records had been brought from Lemuria to Telos. Already the temples had been built in Telos. Atlantis itself started shaking at the same time Lemuria was going down, and Atlantis continued to shake and lose parts of its land for 200 years before it too finally went completely down. For almost 2,000 years after the Atlantean and Lemurian catastrophes, the planet was still shaking. To lose two huge land masses within 200 years of each other, plus the planet was still witnessing the effects of the thermonuclear weapons that had been used in the Atlantean-Lemurian wars. Plus the fact that so much debris had been thrown into the atmosphere that it never became quite bright daylight for almost 300 years after Atlantis' destruction. This caused many life forms, plant forms, to go extinct. Plants that were common in Atlantean times, common in Lemurian times, that no longer exist because they simply couldn't survive the long stages of filtered sunlight. Some have survived, yes, many animals and plants. The human condition in those civilizations that survived it. Egypt, Peru, Roma, better known as India. In many places people became so frightened by the constant earth activity that civilization, even in the last bastillion, started deteriorating very fast. One question I have heard again and again is, well, if Atlantis and Lemuria existed, how come there is not more evidence on the surface of that? That is why most of the cities were shook to rubble. Those that were not shook to rubble were wiped out by the earthquakes or wiped out by the tidal waves. Even those who survived even the tidal waves, even the earthquakes. Hunger was rampant. Disease was rampant. Some areas of civilization, like those future named Egypt and such, did survive. They even kept the civilization intact, but even they started losing the highest elements of the civilization. Many machines quit working because of the filtered sunlight. Many people moved from the cities. They started feeling that living in the city was a death trap because you never knew when a building was going to fall on you. What would look like a very strong building, have it go through 300 to 400 earthquakes. It's a goner. Some buildings were built to withstand it. The Great Pyramid withstood the earthquakes, but it was built with sacred geometries. Other buildings like that throughout the planet survived, but most of the cities were completely reduced to rubble. In many areas they rebuilt the cities, but even then, each time the cities were rebuilt it was on a slightly less, should I say, technology. Each city was a little more primitive than the city before it. The Atlanteans moved into the city which was built underneath the Mato Grosso Plateau in what is now Brazil, which had been Atlantean territories at the time. Getting an understanding of what was happening on the surface. You can perhaps understand how the Lemurians or Atlanteans would prefer to be living underground.